the topic of the tariffs and, of course, the fact that apparently several countries have already made conversations or calls to the president about reducing their tariffs. What is the opinion there, first of all, among the members of the House Ways and Means, but then I want to talk about members of the House of Representatives as well. What is the feeling at this point?
I think it needs to be framed in context, Lockwood, that the average American, and truth be told, I wouldn't know this if I were not in Congress, needs to know about the dire straits that we are as far as our trade deficit. We are in an absolute horrific position. The Biden administration did absolutely nothing for the last 4 years on trade. I mean, literally nothing. And what we have seen is the American economy have turned into essentially a service economy, a government employment economy, and not a manufacturing economy. You know, the great NAFTA deal, which really, remember Ross Perot had said, you hear that huge sucking sound. This is what we're facing. It all goes in line also with the terrible debt that we are now facing. And so what the president is trying to do, he's saying, hey, look, we've let the rest of the world grow on our backs since World War II. And that's really true. There's so many countries that have had trade barriers to American products, services that are unfair. So what the president is doing is saying, hey, knock those down. You can either influence one of two ways, either via military or economically. We don't want military intervention, not by any means. We want economic intervention, and that really is the purpose of these tariffs. It was great to see that 75 countries understand this, are coming back to the table and saying, we understand we were not fair, we want to renegotiate, and the president rewarded that. China, on the other hand, which wants one world order, is going to be a lot more hardball to play with, but I ultimately see us winning that also.
The question goes to the willingness on the part of Congress, specifically members of the Republican caucus, to stand fast with the president on this. He mentions the word tariffs, and it's as if it instantly occurs. It's going to take weeks to accomplish the set up all the tariff arrangements. It also is a matter, it seems to me, of time before we actually see any major negative impacts in spite of what's happening on Wall Street. Does Congress, do the Republican in the caucus, are they willing to stand firm and be patient?
Yeah, that's the real difficulty. And, you know, Lockwood, as a physician, sometimes I can get patients healthy very, very quickly. I take a kidney stone out and they feel better immediately. Other times it is waiting. It is letting the medication, the treatment work. And this is the hard part. It's hard when the nation is not feeling well, a patient's not feeling well, letting medication work and these tariffs to work. It's difficult because you hear so many people that, sadly enough, in the short term will be adversely affected. But I think long term, realizing that this is to try to build the economic structure of the United States so that we are strong, we are not just reliant on other countries for so much, like pharmaceuticals or so many other things. It's a waiting game and waiting it out, and I know it's hard to be patient, but the mainstream media is doing us no good in trying to frenzy up everything.
The president announced a 90-day moratorium, if you will, a stay in place for the moment, a hold, and instantly the stock market rises. But nothing's changed. It's same this afternoon as it was this morning. It's just stunning to see this kind of reaction. And I'm thinking from people who really do have a great deal of talent and knowledge in their economics. And, of course, we're seeing, I think, a pretty interesting divide in that regard as well. We're looking at that relationship to members of the House of Representatives, the Senate as well. Again, what can we anticipate, or what should we anticipate between now and Easter break as far as the reaction to the president's proposal on tariffs?
Well, I think it's going to be more of the same, seeing which company or countries rather come to the table.
Okay.
It'll probably escalate with China because China does not want to see its attempt at world supremacy undermined. So it's going to be, the stakes are going to be high with China, but China cannot survive on domestic production. If you recall the days of Ronald Reagan, on how he was able to break the Soviet Union with the assistance of Pope Paul II, he was able to do it economically, not militarily. And he was able basically to isolate Russia, isolate the Soviet Union, and break them economically. If you look at what China is, they have a third of their GDP is domestic production. They can't domestic consumption. They consume only a third of what they have in their economy. So if they want to block American goods and they don't want to sell their goods, it's not going to bode well for their economy. And so at some point, we can outlast them. It makes some short-term pain, but the people have to realize this, and it's hard. I understand this. People have to realize this, that this is not an overnight kind of thing. We didn't come here overnight. It's not going to be changed overnight.
All right. Another area, of course, concern, and let's talk about this relative to the economy, that, of course, the work that Elon Musk is underway with Doge. What impact is this having now really on federal services and some of the areas that, of course, you've been concerned with? Medicare, Social Security. I am also interested in the impact of potentially on the military. And I did see an interesting story that the Army is looking at a reduction in force by about 90,000 men, which is interesting about that. But what impact is this having on short term, the immediate services of federal government, and what's your thoughts about long term?
Well, I think short term, it was great to see people actually forced to come back and do their jobs in Washington, D.C. I was lamenting the other day the terrible, terrible traffic in Washington that is because people are forced to come back and do their jobs. CMS, nobody was in the parking lot for 4 years. So, it's kind of nice to force people to go back to work. However, there is redundancy in a lot of what's happening in federal agencies. I don't think services get changed any differently than they were previously. But one word I think that is critical for people to understand, and I think this is filtering down really into the private sector, into everything, is accountability.
Right.
For too long, people have just taken for granted, you just spend this, you spend that, and it's not a worry. Now people are saying, why are we spending this? And small businesses are doing a lot. Why am I spending this on this? So it's accountability, and it filters down into everything, into Medicare, into the Medicaid population, into the VA, which overhired by their own admission, 80,000 people. They overspent the budget, $160 billion in the last 4 years, while really not changing the number of veterans that they took care of. It's called accountability and efficiency, and it's long since past time that our federal government looked at itself to do it.
You mentioned earlier the role of the, basically, I'm going to say the legacy media, particularly the metro media. The fact that we've seen these calls of fear and fear-mongering, I would call that, particularly for veterans and for Social Security recipients, I find this hard to believe that, one, this is the continuing mantra of those opposed to any efforts towards efficiency. I'm disappointed, obviously, also in the public being so willing to accept these fear-mongering statements.
Well, I was just on a TV show a little while ago, and I won't mention which, and there was just this inflammatory reporter, economic reporter, that skips A and just goes to B.
Right.
Imagine in the days of playing basketball, we see it. A person hits another player, and then the player reacts. So instead of worrying about the problem that started it, they're going to go after the player that reacted.
Right.
They're not worrying about why we are having to do what we're doing. They're just throwing their hands up and trying to incite the public. Our mainstream media, the George Stephanopoulos, those kind of really just fear-mongers are trying to push ratings, are doing nothing for the American people. They're hurting the American people. And so, I just try to say, take a deep breath. Let's look at this. Time will tell. We're going to ride out this storm, but we really need to go through it rather than around it.